I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home, protect our NHS and save lives.
The first lockdown announced to the nation 5 years ago. The retired judge, Baroness Hallett, has concluded the government acted too slowly to identify and grip the pandemic. Earlier actions and all this might not have been necessary.
I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late. All four governments failed to appreciate the scale of the threat or the urgency of response it demanded in the early part of 2020.
Baroness Hallett's report says through February 2020, as infections data grew from around the world, the UK government didn't properly engage or prepare.
February 2020 was a lost month. There was a serious failure by all four governments to appreciate the level of risk and the calamity that the UK faced and the need to inject urgency into the response. The obviously escalating crisis required leadership from the very top.
I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
For weeks, the advice to the public was limited to wash your hands.
I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts, but our judgment is wash.
You've got to do two verses.
Yeah, I think 20 seconds.
But by March, the report says infections were so rampant there was no alternative to lockdown. It should, Baroness Hallett says, have come earlier.
The failure to lock down earlier may have cost lives. Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths.
My mummy died on the 24th of March 2020. And the church made it clear that had a lockdown been a week earlier, people like my mummy would have been saved.
Over the course of the pandemic, above-average death rates used to measure COVID deaths were higher in countries like the US and Italy, but the UK ended up higher than Germany, Sweden and France. In some countries who contained the virus before vaccination programmes started, death rates actually came down. In his own sometimes agonised testimony to the inquiry, Boris Johnson said the expert advice at the time had not always been as unequivocal as some thought.
Just so you know, I look at all this stuff in which we seem so oblivious with horror now. I mean, we should have twigged. We should collectively have twigged much sooner. I should have twigged.
There is more repeated expletives that we're hearing.
And apologies from us for those who may be offended by the language.
News channels had to make on-air apologies back when Dominic Cummings gave his evidence to the inquiry and had his expletive-ridden messages read out. Baroness Hallett said he'd destabilised Number 10 and contributed to a culture of fear and poison.
Would you agree that there was, in the government of which you played a major part, an orgy of narcissism?
Certainly there was.
The report says his boss, Boris Johnson, presided over a chaotic Number 10 in which the shoutiest, most macho voices were often heard most.
I'm delighted to be back.
Baroness Hallett said the then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, overpromised levels of pandemic preparation, and his top health official, now promoted to top civil servant in the land, Chris Wormold, should have corrected that impression.
Now, we have a special broadcast by the Prime Minister.
Baroness Hallett said as the pandemic rolled on, the government failed to learn the lessons from its first delayed lockdown and moved too slowly at great cost that autumn.
Many of the same failings were repeated later in 2020. This was inexcusable. The second wave had been predicted from early in the pandemic.
Baroness Hallett identifies the rollout of the vaccine as a turning point in the COVID story. But at the heart of her report is a tale of the colossal challenge the COVID crisis posed for the British state and the failure of those who govern to meet it.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, is at the COVID Memorial Wall in South London. Victoria.
Matt, it's a reminder actually when you look at this wall just of the sheer scale of those deaths, of the sheer scale of the families and loved ones that were impacted. And actually what you can't see, but just over this wall, of course, is St Thomas's Hospital, which is where the then Prime Minister was taken to intensive care unit. This is a hard-hitting report, but the families themselves today, those who have been left behind, have said, look, they already knew what happened, they already knew who to blame. What they need to know to be reassured is that the next government and governments will take on board some of these lessons. You know, they talked about at the time those who made the rules and those who broke the rules, and there is no getting away from the fact that they remain 5 years later completely furious with the way the pandemic unrolled in this country. Some of that too is that the scientists, one of Baroness Hallett's recommendations is that SAGE, who made the recommendations to government, which weren't always listened to, needed to be bigger in breadth to not be so much of an echo chamber. And then you're talking there about the second wave. Well, we were being told in that second wave that there needed to be a circuit breaker, but that didn't come because Boris Johnson completely rejected it. And we now know that we then had to go into 4 weeks of lockdown, which Baroness Hallett said could have been avoided.
Thank you, Victoria. Kieran.
Thanks, Matt. Well, the inquiry also criticised the way the Scottish and Welsh governments handled the pandemic. Our Scotland correspondent, Catherine Sampson, is in Edinburgh, and our Wales correspondent, Andy Davis, is in Cardiff. First to Catherine.
Yes, well, you'll remember Nicola Sturgeon did almost every COVID briefing during the pandemic herself. Now, in this report, she is praised. She's praised for being a serious and diligent leader, a contrast being drawn there with Boris Johnson, but she is also criticised. She is criticised for excluding or sidelining her own ministers in these gold command meetings the Scottish Government were having, where key decisions were being made and no minutes were being taken. Baroness Hallett also highlights the famously poor relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, saying that a lack of trust between Edinburgh and London was not in the best interests of the public. The report also pinpoints a public perception that Nicola Sturgeon was using the pandemic to bolster support for Scottish independence. And that is a claim I put to the former First Minister inside Holyrood earlier.
I did not act in a political way. I remember actually the outset of COVID in a very private way, one night feeling terrified at what was coming down the road at us, sitting thinking to myself, you've just got to put everything, politics, independence, everything to one side and try to lead through this to the best of your ability. I got things wrong. I will not shy away from that, but I will categorically always refute any suggestion that I had any motive other than trying to do the best for the country.
Now, there was little mention in this report of WhatsApp messages being used by Scottish ministers that the inquiry highlighted were being routinely deleted. Overall, though, Baroness Hallett acknowledged that, of course, devolved leaders were under extreme pressure, but she said if there was to be a future emergency, she felt it was important leaders worked together to minimise political division and come up with a collective response.
Thank you, Catherine. And Andy, what about Wales then?
Well, the Welsh Labour government comes in for similarly scathing criticism for its early response to the pandemic, that it didn't engage fully enough early on with that threat, that it was overly reliant on the UK government. And one damning line stands out. There was an absence of any real strategy pursued by the Welsh government in January and February 2020, despite the level of threat being recognised at that stage. And when it came to the second wave, further deficiencies are laid bare. Wales had the highest age-standardised mortality rate of all the 4 nations between August and December 2020. And the report says that that was likely a combination of failed local lockdowns, imposing the firebreak too late, and the decision to relax measures more quickly than scientists wanted. Clearly, as Catherine was saying, a key theme today has been that extent of tension and distrust between the UK and devolved governments, all too apparent at the time. For the Welsh Government, for its part, and for its then leader, Mark Drakeford, in sharp contrast to Downing Street, there was some praise for the culture of leadership shown at a cabinet level. This is what Mark Drakeford had to say a short while ago.
We look to the report to help us, not to look back, but to look ahead, to think of ways in which, with all that experience and with all that evidence, we could do better another time. And that's why the report deserves to be taken seriously.
What this report won't do, seemingly, is silence those voices, many opposition politicians among them, who've long been calling for a Wales-specific COVID inquiry. And the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, Cymru, today gave a withering assessment of this report, saying it lacked accountability and called it a betrayal.
Thank you, Andy. And in Northern Ireland, the inquiry concluded that decision-making had been chaotic and infected with political machinations. Baroness Hallett said the power-sharing executive was deeply divided along political lines and beset by leaks, and often marred by political disputes between Democratic Unionist and Sinn Féin ministers. First Minister Michelle O'Neill said the lessons must be learned. Well, joining me now is former civil servant Jill Rutter, who's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, and the Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran, who chairs the Commons Health and Social Care Committee. Jill Rutter, first to you. Does this show, this report, that the UK state basically failed the people of Britain when they needed it most?
I think it shows that it really struggled to cope with a crisis of this dimension and appreciated far too late what it was dealing with. Though I think if you look across Europe, across the world, you would find that the UK government was far from unique in finding this a very, very difficult challenge. So I don't think we should say we were exceptional. Everybody else handled this absolutely fantastically, brilliantly, even places that did apparently quite well during the first waves of COVID, like New Zealand. Now, I think thinking about whether the price they paid in terms of cutting their country off effectively from the rest of the world was too high. So I think it's a challenge for all countries, but the state doesn't come out very well from this. I think that's absolutely fair comment.
Yeah, and Layla Moran, it paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it? But not just of our politicians and not just of the UK government, but all four devolved administrations and the people advising them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, today my heart bleeds for all those people who are hearing that number, 23,000 people whose lives might have been saved. Had we locked down just a week earlier, this must be hugely re-triggering for them, let alone the people still living with the long tail of what was left behind. And what struck me by all of this is a lot of that chaos, a lot of the lack of transparency in decision-making, the fact that vulnerable groups were not being taken account of adequately, the fact that the communications were clearly not being led by behavioural scientists, all of that we were shouting from the rooftops from within Parliament to government at the time should have been something that they were listening to, but they weren't. And one of the key recommendations it makes of SAGE is not only should its membership be broadened, but also it levels criticism at the politicians who hid behind the scientists, who said we are following the science, when in fact they weren't entirely. They were tweaking bits of it and then passing it off as if they had no choice. They did have a choice. The other bit that really struck me from it was there was a recommendation around a lack of parliamentary scrutiny. And certainly from where I was sitting, we ended up setting up our own way of scrutinising the government, or the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus. We were so frustrated. Parliament was flying solo. We just didn't have the information to be able to adequately scrutinise the government in what it was doing.
And that goes to the culture, doesn't it, Jill Rutter? Because the inquiry criticises a toxic culture in government. And yet, the current health secretary accused Number 10 just the other day of a toxic culture, that same word. So is the Westminster culture at the root of a lot of our problems here?
I don't think it's usually that toxic. I mean, I think it was exceptionally toxic at the time of Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings and people, though I do think Dominic Cummings did do quite a lot to suggest that a more urgent response was needed. I'm not sure that the report brings that out, his role as being a sort of difficult insurgent against quite complacent people, which I think may have actually helped speed some of the response we did eventually get. I do think it's really difficult, though, when departments can't work well together, don't work well together, and we do see that far too often when Number 10 is poorly organised, when relations between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office aren't working, and also when relations between the UK government and the devolved governments aren't working. And certainly one of the reasons why a lot of that devolved collaboration broke down was a sense, maybe unfair, Nicola Sturgeon just denied this, but
Right.
a sense that, Nicola Sturgeon was playing this for political advantage, and she was cut out of some of the briefings then.
But just, Leila Moran, does it tell us, just that the failings were so great that it would be almost impossible, so great was the breach of trust, for the public even to go into a lockdown like that again?
Well, I think that's a really good point. And actually, trust in politics and politicians, when you are asking, when a government is asking its citizens to do something so extraordinary, one does have to wonder if this happened again now, whether it would be even more difficult. But what it does show is how important it is that we do have the mechanisms to properly listen to the experts. We've never needed them more. What we know for certain is that this will not be the last pandemic. We must prepare for the next one. And I think what Parliament and government needs to look itself in the eye and ask is, we've got this inquiry ongoing. The IFG itself has done lots of work on how many inquiries have come through government, and then the recommendations never get fully implemented. This cannot be one of those inquiries. Every single one of those recommendations must be implemented swiftly. We don't get to decide when the next one comes along, but we must be prepared.
Leila Moran and Jill Rutter, thank you very much.